Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug that feels less like a risk and more like an upgrade. Like someone quietly unlocked the premium version of you. The kind of version who always seems to be half a step ahead of the moment. Things load faster. You think quicker, speak cleaner, move through conversations without that half-second delay that used to follow you everywhere. You don't hesitate. You don't replay things later. You don't walk out of the room wondering what you should have said. You just handle it. And for a while, it's not overwhelming. It's not chaotic. It's efficient. Almost suspiciously efficient. Like the universe looked at your settings and decided to fix them. And that's the part nobody really warns you about. Not that cocaine is dangerous, but that it feels correct. Like success finally stopped taking effort. Tonight we're tracing how one drug reshaped the feeling of confidence itself, and how that shift didn't stay contained to the people who first discovered it. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now. Perhaps tucked under a blanket halfway between curiosity and sleep. Now dim the lights. Take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Here's what makes cocaine feel different. It doesn't promise escape, it promises arrival. Most people don't feel broken. They feel fine, functional, present enough to get through the day, hit deadlines, and say the right things in the meeting without anyone noticing anything missing. Except there's a gap. It's small, but it's always there. It's hard to explain without sounding like you're complaining about nothing, because it is nothing, technically. Just half a second. The thought that arrives slightly after it was needed. The sentence that comes out almost right, and then gets redesigned on the drive home. The feeling in every room that the sharpest version of you is just slightly out of signal range, and no matter what you do, the signal never quite comes in. Nothing dramatic, just a constant sense that you're not quite landing where you meant to. You've assumed this is just you, that some people are built differently, that the ones who always have the answer ready, the timing right, the room leaning forward when they talk are simply made that way. You've never considered there might be a shortcut, until you find it too. White powder, a small amount, unremarkable. You bring it to your nose and inhale, and the back of your throat goes numb, chemical, briefly sweet, like medicine that almost became candy. And then nothing happens for long enough that you think it isn't going to work on you. For a moment, nothing. Then your jaw tightens, not tension, precision, like something in your face has quietly decided to pay attention. Your shoulders drop all at once, like something you've been carrying so long it became part of how you hold yourself, has finally, quietly been set down. You notice it, because it has gone. Your heart becomes more present, not racing, not pounding, just there, like an engine that's been idling finally being asked to move. And then the energy arrives, clean, sudden. The absence of something you didn't realize was there. Your appetite disappears. You don't even notice. Your body has decided it has more important things to do. Your thoughts begin arriving in order, each one present and already finished before you reach for it. Like sentences that exist fully formed somewhere just ahead of you, waiting to be spoken. You're not thinking faster. You're thinking clearly. There is no fog, no distance. Just a precise, almost clinical sense of being completely here, with full access to everything you know and everything you are. You're not high. That's what makes it convincing. The conversation you were half in becomes something you're fully inside of, the timing landing cleanly, the words arriving exactly when they're needed instead of a moment too late. You open your mouth. They come out right, not approximately right. Right. So this is what it's supposed to feel like. They weren't built differently. They just had access to something you didn't. For roughly 20 minutes, there is no gap. Not smaller, not narrower, just gone. Like a problem that quietly resolved itself. And everything works. You feel like you could walk into any room and own it. Like the version of success you've been watching other people have, from a slight distance for years, is suddenly just the room you're standing in. Not someday. Now. This is what they feel like. This is what they've always felt like. And it's so obvious, so available, so completely within reach that the only thing you can't understand is why it took this long to get here. Then it ends. The thoughts stop arriving in order, one coming without the next one behind it, and when you reach for it, there's nothing there. The room settles back into something ordinary. The gap returns, and the gap you come back to is wider than the one you left. Not back to baseline, below it. The drug borrowed something, and the interest comes due immediately. You feel it. Then a thought arrives. Clear, quiet, completely logical. You know how to feel like that again. That thought is where the real story begins. Not the first hit. The first thought after the first hit. The moment you understand exactly what you found, and exactly where to find it again. The story of that feeling is 3,000 years old. It starts with a leaf, not a powder, not a pill, not anything that requires a rolled note and a bathroom at a party. A leaf, chewed slowly, held against the gum, passed between people working at 11,000 feet in the Andes where the air is thin enough that breathing is its own daily project. The people who first used it weren't chasing a high. They were chasing exactly what you just felt. The ability to work longer, think clearer, perform beyond what a body at altitude in cold with not enough food would normally allow. The molecule was the same molecule. The need was the same need. They just got there through a leaf instead of a gram. The Inca considered it sacred, given to soldiers on long marches, offered in religious ceremonies, paid to workers as part of their wages. They had, in other words, a functioning relationship with this plant that would have lasted indefinitely if the rest of the world had left them alone. The rest of the world did not leave them alone. The Spanish arrived in the 16th century and eventually figured out, mostly by accident, that the same leaf-keeping Andean workers functional at altitude also kept their forced labourers alive long enough to mine silver. They had arrived wanting to dismantle whatever they found that wasn't Christian enough, and coca was not Christian enough. They banned it. Pagan, heathen, incompatible with Christian civilization. Missionaries wrote disapproving letters home. Then they looked at the mines at Potosi, in what is now Bolivia, where workers were descending thousands of feet underground in conditions that were killing people at remarkable rates. The coca leaf reduced hunger, increased endurance, made altitude manageable. The output numbers when workers had coca versus when they didn't were not subtle. The prohibitions disappeared. The missionaries kept writing their letters. The silver kept coming. The theology has always been adjustable when the silver is involved. The molecule left the mountains in botanical specimens, dried leaves in glass bottles, the kind of thing European naturalists collected and sent home with letters full of polite curiosity. For 3 centuries it sat in collections, interesting but inert. The ocean crossing destroyed most of the active alkaloids before anyone could study them. The plant had a secret that the journey kept erasing. Then a 25-year-old German chemist called Albert Niemann figured out how to keep it. Niemann was finishing his doctoral dissertation in 1860, working in a chemistry lab in Göttingen, the kind of meticulous young scientist whose notes had footnotes and whose footnotes had notes. He was experimenting with coca leaves, trying to isolate whatever was actually inside them, using solvents and patience and the specific obsessive persistence that German university chemistry in the 19th century practically required by law. The process was not glamorous. You took the leaves, treated them with solvents, filtered, evaporated, adjusted the acidity, filtered again. It was the chemical equivalent of wringing out a dishcloth until you found out what the cloth was made of. Niemann did this carefully and repeatedly until something crystalline and white appeared in his apparatus. He extracted the compound, described its properties, and then, because this was 1860 and safety protocols were more of a suggestion than a requirement, he tasted it. His tongue went numb. He noted this in his dissertation, named the compound cocaine, coca plus the standard "-in" suffix, a naming decision so workmanlike it suggests nobody in the room understood what they were holding, described the bitter taste, the spreading numbness, the absence of sensation, filed it carefully, published it. Then he died, 26 years old, chemical exposure. He never saw a clinical application. He never saw a medical revolution. He never saw a generation of rappers, a war on drugs, or a single gram of anything sold in a bathroom. He isolated the molecule that millions of people would spend the next century and a half trying to get access to, and his main observation was that it made his tongue feel strange. The molecule sat in the literature and waited. It was waiting for someone to understand what it could do. Not to a tongue. To a person who needed to be somewhere, performing at something, and couldn't quite get there on their own. The person who figured it out was a young Austrian eye doctor named Karl Koller, and the problem he was trying to solve was one of the more nightmarish in the history of medicine: eye surgery on a conscious patient, before anaesthesia worked on eyes. Before 1884, if you needed surgery on your eye, you got restrained. Because the alternative was worse. General anaesthesia with ether or chloroform was too risky. For procedures where the patient needed to hold still and follow instructions. So the surgeon worked fast, the patient screamed and moved, and everyone pretended this was an acceptable situation. The era of bite down on something had lasted longer than anyone wanted to admit. Koller had read about cocaine's numbing properties. He had a small amount. He did what every scientist does when they're about to make history, which is test it on themselves first, dropping a cocaine solution into his own eye, waiting, then poking at the eye with a pin to see what happened. He could not feel the pin. He borrowed the eye of a frog, then a rabbit, then a dog. None of them complained. Science. He couldn't even afford to travel to present his findings, so he sent a colleague named Brettauer to read the paper at the Ophthalmological Society of Heidelberg in September 1884. The audience contained most of the relevant surgical expertise in Europe, Brettauer read. The audience absorbed. Within weeks, surgeons across the continent were using cocaine as a local anaesthetic. Within months, it was standard. The era of the screaming, restrained patient was over. For the first time, a surgeon could work with precision instead of speed, could take his time, could be genuinely good at the job without the patient's pain being a variable. Think about what that actually meant. Surgery had always been a race. The faster you were, the better your survival rates, because every second under the knife was a second of agony and movement and blood loss and things going wrong. Speed was the surgeon's primary skill. Speed was what separated good surgeons from bad ones. Speed was what you practiced. Cocaine made speed irrelevant. Suddenly the patient was still, cooperative, not screaming. The surgeon could slow down, could think, could be precise rather than just fast. In the space of a few months, a young Austrian doctor who couldn't afford train fare had changed what surgery meant. Cocaine had just made competence effortless. For surgeons at least. Word was going to spread. Word spread immediately to Vienna, where a 30-year-old neurologist named Sigmund Freud was reading everything he could find about the new compound and arriving at conclusions that would later embarrass his biographers considerably. Freud on cocaine was Freud at his most Freud. Enthusiastic, confident, comprehensively wrong in ways that took decades to fully catalogue. His 1884 paper, Über Coca, proposed cocaine as a treatment for morphine addiction, alcohol dependence, fatigue, depression, and what he called nervous exhaustion. Essentially every problem a Viennese intellectual might have, plus several they hadn't thought of yet. He described what it felt like to take it. Exhilaration, lasting euphoria, increased capacity for work, no impairment of any kind. He recommended doses. He described taking it himself before presentations when he needed to perform at his best, which is, if you squint, the entire title of this video, written in 1884 by the father of psychoanalysis, about himself. Freud was not being reckless. By the standards of 1884, he was being thorough. Self-experimentation was how you established that something worked. You took it. You observed yourself carefully. You wrote down what happened. He noted the lifted mood, the absence of fatigue, the way difficult ideas arrange themselves more easily than usual. He noted that he felt ready for things he had been avoiding, that his correspondence became more energetic, that conversations he'd been dreading became ones he looked forward to. He sent some to his fiancée Martha, who was in a different city. He wrote to her about it with the enthusiasm of someone who has found something they think everyone should know about, which, in 1884, cocaine genuinely was. He sent it to colleagues. He gave it to patients. He became, for a brief period, the most enthusiastic cocaine advocate in Vienna, which is saying something, because Vienna in 1884 had a lot of enthusiastic cocaine advocates. The friend's name was Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow. He was brilliant, he was suffering, and the theory was wrong. While Freud was writing enthusiastic letters about the drug's promise, Fleischl-Marxow was quietly escalating. He began injecting it, which produced effects far beyond what Freud's carefully recommended doses created. The same molecule, a different delivery, a completely different intensity. The doses climbed. The paranoid symptoms arrived. He began experiencing what users of that era described as cocaine bugs, the crawling sensation under the skin that comes with heavy stimulant use, the feeling that something is moving beneath the surface that isn't there. Freud kept visiting, kept hoping the situation would stabilize, kept writing letters that were, by this point, noticeably less enthusiastic about cocaine's therapeutic promise. Fleischl-Marxow died in 1891 at 45, destroyed by the original injury, the morphine and the cocaine that was supposed to fix the morphine. Freud quietly stopped writing about cocaine's medical applications. The guilt, his letters suggest, followed him for decades. His biographers have spent a century deciding how prominently to feature the episode, some treating it as a minor detour, others noting that a close friend dying from a drug you enthusiastically promoted is not, in any reasonable accounting, a minor detour. The pharmacies, however, had not stopped selling it. The late 19th century produced a category of cocaine product that reads, from this distance, like absurdist satire, but was at the time just retail. Cocaine toothache drops for children, hay fever cures, tonics for women's fatigue, throat lozenges for singers, and then the one that earns a permanent place in pharmaceutical history, a coca wine called Vin Mariani, produced by a Corsican entrepreneur named Angelo Mariani, that became the most celebrated health beverage in the Western world. Vin Mariani was endorsed by Queen Victoria, by Thomas Edison, who said it helped him stay awake during long experiments, by Jules Verne, by Ulysses Grant, who was drinking it while dying of throat cancer and said it helped with the pain, and by Pope Leo XIII, who reportedly carried it in his personal flask and awarded Mariani a gold medal from the Vatican. The Vatican, a gold medal for the cocaine wine. Mariani understood, ahead of his time, that celebrity approval would sell beverages in ways that ingredients lists never would. He sent free cases to everyone worth quoting and kept the letters. He assembled an album of testimonials, hundreds of them, from heads of state, from scientists, from artists, from military commanders, from athletes. The album ran to multiple volumes. It was essentially the 19th century's version of a verified Instagram account, except the verified users included the sitting Pope and a former President of the United States. The product sold effortless vitality, energy without effort, clarity without cost, which is, you'll notice, exactly what cocaine has always sold. Mariani just had better branding and a papal endorsement. The drug that would one day carry mandatory federal prison sentences was, in 1890, receiving Vatican commendation. Same molecule. The Pope carried it in his pocket. An American pharmacist was watching all of this and thinking, I could do that without the wine. His name was John Pemberton. He was a Confederate, veteran who had developed morphine dependence after being wounded in the Civil War, which meant he had both personal and professional reasons to be interested in what coca could do. He had been selling his own coca wine, French one coca, until Atlanta passed prohibition laws in 1886 and forced him to reformulate. He kept the coca extract, added cola nut for caffeine, added carbonation, created a syrup he described as a brain tonic, which was, in the 19th century, how you said this will help you think better, without the FDA asking questions. He was trying to bottle the feeling, make it affordable, sell it to everyone who couldn't afford imported Parisian wine, democratize the upgrade. He called it Coca-Cola. The formula contained actual cocaine. The name was, in the strictest sense, accurate. Pemberton sold the formula before it became what it became, then died 2 years later in poverty while the product was being sold across Atlanta. The man who bought it, Asa, Candler, became wealthy. Pemberton became a footnote in his own invention, which is, in the tradition of people who sell too early, one of the most human endings in this entire story. Candler was a businessman, not a chemist, and he had the instincts of someone who understood that what he was selling was a feeling, not a beverage. He expanded distribution aggressively. By 1895, Coca-Cola was being sold in every state in America. By 1900, it was in Canada, Hawaii, and Mexico. The syrup was shipped in barrels to soda fountains, where it was mixed with carbonated water and served to people who wanted energy, clarity, and the specific sensation of capability that a small amount of cocaine reliably produced. They got it. They came back. The business grew. By 1903, Coca-Cola quietly removed the cocaine alkaloids, replaced them with decocainized coca leaf extract. The same leaf, the same plant, minus the relevant compound. The name stayed. The branding stayed. The bottle stayed. Legally, apparently, all of that was fine. The world's most successful beverage had been built in part on selling people the feeling of effortless capability. When the cocaine came out, they replaced it with caffeine and kept going. The feeling was slightly different. The business model was identical. By 1900, physicians were starting to notice something the pharmacies had not yet acknowledged. The same drug that had ended the era of screaming eye surgery patients that Freud had taken before presentations, that the Pope had carried in his pocket, that had been sold in children's toothache medicine and mixed into the world's most popular soft drink. That drug, it turned out, produced dependency when used repeatedly. Not the vague, theoretical kind of dependency, the clinical kind. The kind showing up in waiting rooms, in patients who had started with the toothache drops or the hay fever cure or the brain tonic and could not stop. The crash after use drove more use. The dose climbed. The biology was consistent. Dopamine borrowed, the brain demanding it back, the cycle uninterested in the user's plans. There was something specific about cocaine dependency that made it different from the opioid problems doctors had been tracking for decades. Opioid users deteriorated visibly. The withdrawal was obvious and physical. You could see it in the room. cocaine users often kept functioning, kept working, kept appearing at events, giving presentations, performing. The gap they were trying to close stayed closed as long as the cocaine held. It was only when they stopped that the problem became visible, which meant stopping was the thing most people avoided. The drug didn't make people successful. It made them feel like they couldn't succeed without it. Which is a different sentence with the same words in a different order. The medical establishment was, with the particular slowness it reserves for conclusions that require telling people they can't sell things, beginning to raise concerns. Papers were published. A few newspapers ran stories. The political response when it finally arrived would have almost nothing to do with the medical evidence and almost everything to do with something else entirely. The cocaine that had been endorsed by the Vatican, put in soft drinks, and sold in every pharmacy in America was about to become the foundation for something that would fill prisons for the next 100 years. That story starts with a man named Hamilton Wright, a State Department official who had never practiced medicine, had limited experience in pharmacology, and had very specific ideas about who was using cocaine and why. His congressional testimony in 1910 would help lay the groundwork for the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, the first major federal drug legislation in American history. The medical evidence, the doctors' concerns, the clinical data that had been accumulating for a decade, none of that is what drove the legislation. What drove it was something Hamilton Wright told Congress about cocaine and black Americans in the South. Claims so inflammatory, so detached from any evidence, so nakedly constructed to generate fear rather than inform policy, that even the newspapers of 1910 found some of them worth questioning. The molecule hadn't changed. The people using it hadn't fundamentally changed. What changed was who politicians decided was using it, and why, and what that meant for the story they needed to tell. The honeymoon was ending, not because the science demanded it, because the politics did. The political response to cocaine, when it finally arrived, had almost nothing to do with the medical evidence. The medical evidence existed. Physicians had been documenting cocaine dependency for years. Case reports, conference presentations, letters to congressional representatives. The clinical picture was real. The addiction was real. The harm was real. All of that existed and moved through political systems at the speed that medical evidence typically moves through political systems, which is somewhere between slowly and not at all. What moved fast was newspapers. Specifically, a particular kind of newspaper story that began circulating in the American South around 1900, featuring black men, cocaine, and descriptions of what the cocaine was supposedly doing to them that bore no relationship to anything a pharmacologist would recognize. The stories followed a pattern. A black man uses cocaine. He becomes violent, superhuman, immune to pain, sexually threatening. Law enforcement is overwhelmed. Standard police equipment is insufficient. The cocaine has made him something other than human. The stories were fabricated, not exaggerated, fabricated. The events described either did not occur or occurred in forms so different from the reporting that fabricated is the accurate word. A man named Hamilton Wright was appointed as a US government representative on international opium control and testified before Congress in 1910 that cocaine was turning black men into a threat to white women and requiring both prohibition and enhanced law enforcement. He cited newspaper reports. The newspaper reports cited each other. When pressed for medical evidence, he cited more newspaper reports. The circle was complete. The testimony was entered into the record anyway. This is called evidence-based policy. The evidence, in this case, was a stack of newspapers that cited themselves. Southern law enforcement agencies reported that standard revolver bullets were insufficient against black men using cocaine because the cocaine gave them superhuman resistance to injury. Several departments changed their sidearms. They were responding to a threat that existed entirely in newspaper columns, written by people who had invented it, describing something pharmacologically impossible. Cocaine does not make people bulletproof. This is not a contested pharmacological question. It was not a contested pharmacological question in 1910 either, among people who had actually studied pharmacology. None of this appeared unusual at the time. It appeared in congressional testimony and in major newspapers, and was treated as though it had the same relationship to fact as weather reporting. The testimony was entered into the record. The law was drafted. The law passed. The cocaine that had been the Pope's pocket companion, Freud's presentation aid, and the primary ingredient in America's most popular soft drink was about to become the legal foundation of a carceral project that would run for the next 100 years. The medical concerns were real. The mechanism that addressed them was not. The law that resulted was called the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, and it passed in 1914. It didn't ban cocaine outright. That framing would have been constitutionally messy, and constitutionally messy is how lawyers say, we want this to happen, but we need a workaround. Instead, it required anyone who handled cocaine or opiates to register with the Treasury Department and pay a tax. Unregistered handling became a federal crime. Physicians could technically still prescribe, but the definition of legitimate medical use was written narrowly enough that prescribing to addicts became legally hazardous. Doctors who did it were prosecuted. Most stopped. The practical effect was identical to a ban. Cocaine vanished from pharmacies, the children's toothache drops disappeared, the hay fever cures disappeared, the tonics for women's fatigue disappeared, the era of cocaine as an ordinary retail product sitting next to the aspirin with a cheerful cartoon on the label was over. What replaced it was not the absence of cocaine. What replaced it was a supply chain, networks of people willing to obtain and distribute an illegal substance at a premium to a market that had not disappeared, just been redirected. The price went up immediately. The quality became unpredictable. The transaction moved from the pharmacy counter to arrangements conducted in considerably less comfortable settings. Everyone involved took on a new category of legal risk that hadn't existed before. The cocaine itself was the same cocaine. The paperwork situation had changed. The drug that Freud had taken before presentations, that the Pope had carried in his pocket, that had been mixed into the world's most popular soft drink, was now a criminal commodity. Same molecule, different paperwork. The United States government had successfully moved cocaine from the pharmacy shelf to the back room, and the back room, as it turned out, was already occupied. The music was there waiting for it. Jazz emerged from New Orleans in the years around the Harrison Act, carrying with it a specific relationship to what was legal and what wasn't. Black artists in a segregated industry worked hours and venues that official enforcement found inconvenient to monitor. The jazz club at 2 a.m, in a city where the police who could arrest musicians were also customers of the nightlife. That ecosystem was not airtight. Things circulated. The music documented it openly. Cocaine Blues was recorded multiple times in the 20s and 30s by different artists. Take a Whiff on Me was a folk song that described cocaine with the casual directness of someone listing what they had for breakfast. These weren't cautionary tales. They were texture, descriptions of an environment that both artist and audiences inhabited. The cocaine wasn't the point, it was furniture. Cab Calloway performed Minnie the Moocher, about a woman who would take the occasional trip to Cocaine Town, in top hat and tails, in Hollywood films, including a Betty Boop cartoon released by Paramount Pictures. The drug content was visible in the lyrics to anyone listening. Nobody prosecuted Cab Calloway. Nobody prosecuted Paramount. Nobody was particularly bothered. Calloway's Harlem world operated on its own logic. The Cotton Club, where he performed for years, was a whites-only venue in the middle of Harlem, that employed black musicians to perform for white audiences, while black Harlem residents were not permitted to enter as customers. The cocaine that circulated in those rooms was, in that sense, consistent with everything else about the arrangement: present, tolerated, unremarkable, and invisible to anyone with an official reason to notice. The whole enterprise was a masterclass in how to benefit from a community while simultaneously excluding it, and nobody in a position of authority found this arrangement worth examining particularly closely. The enforcement of the Harrison Act, like the enforcement of most American drug legislation, was calibrated to the social position of the people involved. The jazz world, black, late night, already surveilled in ways that had nothing to do with cocaine, operated in an environment where the drug's presence was tolerated with a particular tolerance extended to people who are economically useful and socially excluded. The cocaine in wealthy uptown apartments was producing no prosecutions at all. The gap between who was actually using cocaine and who faced consequences for it was visible to anyone who cared to look. Most people with official power did not apparently care to look. Through the 30s and into the 50s, cocaine's market share was quietly absorbed by a competitor. Amphetamines arrived in the early 30s, initially approved for nasal congestion, the kind of humble entry point that has historically preceded enormously consequential things. Benzedrine, available over the counter in inhaler form. The inhaler was a small cardboard tube containing a strip of paper soaked in amphetamine that you inhaled through your nose. You could walk into any pharmacy and buy one without a prescription. Many people did. Many more discovered that if you broke open the tube and ate the paper, the effect was considerably more pronounced than the manufacturer had intended. The manufacturer, Burroughs Wellcome, noted this. Nobody took the inhalers off the shelves. Within a few years, amphetamines were being prescribed for depression, for narcolepsy, for the general category of feeling insufficiently energetic in a world that was increasingly demanding energy. The diet pill market found them. The productivity market found them. The medical establishment prescribed them with an enthusiasm that would later seem, in retrospect, extraordinary. By the 40s, amphetamines had been distributed to soldiers on multiple sides of the Second World War. British forces, American forces, German forces, who used methamphetamine under the brand name Pervitin, manufactured in large quantities and issued to tank crews, pilots, and infantry on the theory that exhausted soldiers fought worse than alert ones, and chemistry had something to offer. Japanese pilots received it before missions. Everybody had the same idea simultaneously. Nobody thought carefully about what happened afterward. The soldiers came home. Some of them kept using. The post-war amphetamine market, Benzedrine, then Dexedrine, then a long roster of branded formulations, was one of the defining pharmaceutical realities of mid-century American life. Housewives were prescribed it for depression and weight management. Students used it for studying. Truck drivers used it to stay awake. Jack Kerouac typed on the road on a continuous scroll of paper while on Benzedrine, which explains a great deal about the book's structure. Writers used it for the same reason their successors would later use cocaine, because it made the work feel possible in ways it otherwise didn't. Legal, cheap, available with a prescription that physicians dispensed with a generosity that would later become controversial. Cocaine was expensive, scarce, and illegal. The gap-closing feeling had a legal alternative for 30 years. Cocaine survived as a drug of musicians, bohemians, and the small criminal economy that served them. Not gone, waiting. What it was waiting for was the 1970s. The amphetamine market collapsed in the early 70s under the weight of its own excess. The Controlled Substance Act of 1970 moved amphetamines onto Schedule II, tightening prescriptions considerably. The culture that had been using them, students, housewives, truck drivers, writers, suddenly found the supply restricted. The legal gap closer had been taken away. Nobody asked what would replace it. Something always replaces it. The 1970s provided, in useful sequence, a generation deeply skeptical of official drug narratives after watching the government catastrophically overstate marijuana's dangers, a nightlife culture organised around extravagant sensation, in rooms where inhibition was the enemy and class was temporarily suspended, and a Colombian supply chain that had been quietly building infrastructure for a decade and was ready for a larger market. Cocaine re-emerged into that opening like something that had been in storage and still fit perfectly. The first users in the revival were again wealthy, entertainers, executives, people in rooms where the names meant something. Studio 54 in New York, the back rooms of Los Angeles recording industry parties. A gram in the late 70s cost roughly $100. In today's money, closer to $500. The price itself was a social filter. The drug was designed by cost alone to stay in the right rooms. Studio 54 opened in 1977 and became, within weeks, the most famous nightclub in the world. The door policy was openly and aggressively arbitrary. Steve Rubell, the co-owner, selected guests based on appearance, celebrity, and a calculation of what the room would look like that night. On any given night, the people inside might include Mick Jagger, Andy Warhol, Liza Minnelli, Halston, Calvin Klein. The people outside might include perfectly reasonable human beings who had committed no crime beyond looking insufficiently interesting to Steve Rubell, which is not a crime but was treated as one. The cocaine wasn't hidden. It was part of the furniture, present in the VIP rooms, in the bathrooms, at the bar, in quantities, and at a visibility that suggested everyone had agreed collectively to treat it as unremarkable. What it found there was a perfect environment. Cocaine didn't look like what addiction looked like in the public imagination. Addiction looked like desperation, like heroin, like the visible decay and poverty that the post-Harrison newspapers had associated with drugs. Cocaine looked like the opposite. A man in a good suit in a velvet room who always knew what to say next. Energy without exhaustion. Confidence that didn't need managing. The meeting you arrived to already prepared for. The drug associated success with itself so effectively that the association became the product. You weren't buying cocaine, you were buying entry into the room where cocaine was, and the room where cocaine was looked like the room where success lived. There's a quality to cocaine's 70s image that no other drug has quite replicated, and it comes from the same gap it had always closed. The confidence without anxiety, the words arriving before you needed them, the room feeling like something you were handling rather than enduring. That feeling experienced in rooms full of people who were actually successful, in industries where confidence was currency, created an image the drug would carry for a decade. Consider what the drug was promising, and to whom. The people using it in the late 70s weren't looking for escape. They weren't trying to numb pain or check out of their lives. They were already in the room. They were already at the table. What the cocaine offered was the feeling of deserving to be there, of finally being the version of themselves the room required. The gap closed, the signal clear. For a population that had built its identity around performance and achievement, that specific promise was close to, irresistible. Newsweek ran a piece in 1974 that described cocaine as a sophisticated adult pleasure. Rolling Stone, Time, the New York Times, all ran coverage treating cocaine not as a public health emergency, but as a cultural development worth reporting. The coverage was not paid for. It reflected what the writers actually saw. In the rooms they were in, cocaine looked fine. They were in the rooms where it looked fine. They were not in the rooms where it didn't. This is called journalism. It was about to stop looking fine. The first direction it stopped looking fine was Wall Street. The culture of cocaine in American finance in the 80s is one of those things everyone knew about, many people reported on and almost nobody faced legal consequences for. Trading floors, investment banks, the back rooms of client dinners where deals were made the way deals were made in the 80s, loudly, with the specific social energy of rooms full of people who believe they are winning at something. The culture had its own rituals, bathroom breaks during dinner that lasted slightly longer than bathroom breaks usually do, the particular restlessness of meetings after lunch, the way certain conversations accelerated past the pace that sober thought allows. Nobody announced anything. Nobody needed to. The rooms understood their own chemistry. Cocaine fit those rooms with the same logic it fit Studio 54. It amplified what was already there. Confidence became more confident. The pitch sharpened. The conversation moved faster. The drug that made people feel like the best version of themselves had found an environment in which the best version of yourself was, literally, the product you were selling. There is a specific irony here. Cocaine increases confidence dramatically. It does not increase competence at the same rate. Studies of cognitive performance under cocaine show improved reaction times in some tasks and significantly impaired judgment, risk assessment and impulse control in others. A cocaine trader felt like they were making better decisions. The records of what those decisions actually were suggest the feeling was not always accurate. This distinction between feeling competent and being competent is, when you think about it, the entire cocaine story in one sentence. The 80s financial world was running a large-scale experiment on what happens when stimulants combine with high-stakes decisions under competitive pressure. The results are available in the form of various scandals, regulatory actions, and spectacular collapses of the period. The cocaine was not the only variable. It was present for most of the experiments. Oliver Stone's Wall Street, released in 1987, included cocaine as a feature of the environment rather than a plot point. He meant it as a critique. A significant portion of his audience received it as an aesthetic statement about what success looked like. Both readings were accurate. That is how the cocaine image sustained itself through a decade in which the evidence against it was accumulating. The entertainment industry had its own accounting to do. John Belushi died in March 1982 from a cocaine and heroin combination. He was 33. One of the most successful comedic performers in American television and film history. Saturday Night Live's original cast, the Blues Brothers' Animal House. The night he died, he was with friends, then alone, found in the morning by a trainer who had come for a planned workout. The forensic picture was of a man who'd been using for hours without visible distress, until there was distress, and then there was nothing. His death produced a particular kind of shock. Not the shock of something unexpected, but the shock of the thing everyone had been not quite saying becoming undeniable. The rooms that Belushi had moved through, the people who had been with him in those rooms, the culture that had normalized what was in those rooms, all of it was suddenly visible in a way it hadn't been when the consequences stayed private. Richard Pryor set himself on fire in June 1980 while freebasing cocaine. The version he performed on stage later was, he was running down the street because he was on fire. A police car pulled up alongside him. The officer asked where he was running. Pryor said to the hospital. The officer said, "Get in." The comedy of this is genuine. It exists alongside the fact that he suffered serious burns to much of his body and came very close to dying. Pryor made the fire into material. The audiences laughed. The gap between the dignity of the performance and the chaos of the event that produced it is exactly where good comedy lives, and Pryor knew exactly where that was. Stevie Nicks, by her own later account, had a hole in her nose by the early 80s from cocaine use. The treatment a doctor prescribed for her withdrawal, a benzodiazepine, became its own dependency she later described as worse than the cocaine. She eventually recovered from both. The treatment for her cocaine problem was an addiction to prescription tranquilizers. The treatment for the tranquilizer addiction was years of difficult work. The accounting, as always, came due eventually. These were not edge cases. These were the most successful entertainers of their generation. The drug that looked like success was showing its cost to the people who could most clearly afford it. The price was still too high. The general public had not yet received this information in a form that changed behavior. That would require something that happened on a basketball court in Maryland in June 1986. In Colombia, a man named Pablo Escobar had been watching the American market with the focused attention of someone who understands that demand without organized supply is just a business opportunity waiting to be claimed. Escobar was born in 1949, the son of a farmer and a schoolteacher. He started in petty crime, contraband, cigarettes, fake lottery tickets, car theft. He graduated quickly. By his own account, he arranged for some car owners to be kidnapped until ransom was paid, which suggests either a flexible relationship with the concept of theft or a man who simply thought 3 steps ahead of everyone around him. Probably both. He moved into cocaine in the early 70s, when the infrastructure barely existed, when most of what reached the United States came in small quantities carried by individuals. He looked at what was missing. Processing facilities in the Colombian jungle, transportation networks through the Caribbean, planes first, then boats, then semi-submersibles that ran just below the surface of the water where radar couldn't find them, distribution connections in Miami that spread across the American market. He built what was missing, with the patient logistical focus of someone who understood that infrastructure was everything. Miami in the late 70s and early 80s became the entry point for most of the cocaine reaching the United States, and it looked like it. Homicide rates spiked. The term cocaine cowboys entered the vocabulary. The Miami metro area, which had been handling roughly $25 million worth of cocaine annually in the early 70s, was processing something closer to $7 billion by the early 80s. The Dade County Medical Examiner's Office ran out of refrigeration space for homicide victims at one point, and had to rent refrigerated trucks. The cocaine economy was larger than the regular economy in significant portions of the city. The business model had an unusually aggressive approach to competition and regulation. The phrase was plata o plomo, silver or lead, a bribe or a bullet. The choice offered to police officers, politicians, judges, anyone in a position to be useful or obstructive. The Medellin cartel controlled an estimated 80% of cocaine entering the United States by 1980. The DEA was still largely treating cocaine as a secondary concern behind heroin. The cocaine arriving in Miami on private planes, at airstrips in the Florida Keys, in boats with false bottoms, was outpacing enforcement capacity by a margin that would not become fully visible until the situation had been running for years. The DEA would later describe this period as a time of limited resources and competing priorities. The Medellin cartel would later describe this period as the good years. By the mid-80s, something had happened to the price. All that Colombian infrastructure, all those supply networks, they had worked too well. Supply was exceeding the market the Velvet Rooms represented. A gram that had cost $100 in the late 70s was available for significantly less. The drug was looking for new customers. A chemistry change that required only baking soda and water was about to deliver cocaine to a market that Studio 54 had never intended to serve. The price drop and the chemistry change arrived at roughly the same time, in the same neighborhoods, with results that would reshape American cities, fill American prisons, and produce legislation so punitive it is still being argued about today. Escobar, meanwhile, would appear on Forbes' list of the world's billionaires in 1987. He had been working toward it patiently since the early 70s. He had one rule, applied consistently, and the American government was about to discover exactly how seriously he meant it. Len Bias was 22 years old and had just achieved the thing that most American kids spend their entire childhoods imagining. Second overall pick in the 1986 NBA draft, selected by the Boston Celtics, one of the most storied franchises in the history of the sport. He had been the best player in the Atlantic Coast Conference for 2 straight years, 6'8", with the wingspan and quickness and specific combination of athletic gifts that scouts describe in terms usually reserved for geological features. He had gone from Landover, Maryland to the University of Maryland, to the moment when the commissioner called his name and he walked to the podium in a white suit and shook hands in front of cameras. He signed a sponsorship deal with Reebok the day after the draft. He called his mother from New York that night. She said later he sounded happier than she had ever heard him. 2 days later, he was dead. Cocaine cardiac arrest. Early morning, a dormitory room at the University of Maryland. Friends were there. One of them called for help. Paramedics arrived and could not revive him. He was pronounced dead at Leland Memorial Hospital at 8:55 in the morning. He was 22 years old and had been an NBA first-round pick for approximately 48 hours. He had won the Reebok contract for less than that. The news moved fast. Drug deaths rarely do. But Bias was not who the public imagination associated with cocaine fatalities. He was not a rock musician in a hotel room. He was not a figure anyone had been watching with concern. He was the opposite of that. A young man at the beginning of what should have been a long career, who had just received the reward the entire structure of American youth athletics is organized to promise. The media had spent the previous decade describing cocaine as a sophisticated adult pleasure. The rooms where they had observed it had been Studio 54 and Wall Street. Bias was not from those rooms. His death arrived in a different register entirely. The misreporting made it worse. Early news accounts stated he had died from crack cocaine. He hadn't. It was powder. But crack was the molecule driving political urgency in the summer of 1986, and the correction circulated slowly. By the time it reached the people who needed it, the legislation was already moving. Members of Congress flew back from summer recess. Committee hearings that normally take months were compressed into weeks. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 passed in October, drafted, debated and enacted within months of one 22-year-old's death, at a speed the American legislative process rarely achieves for anything. For comparison, a bipartisan infrastructure bill in 2021 took approximately 7 years from first proposal to passage. One basketball player died and Congress moved in 4 months. The American legislative system has priorities. They are occasionally visible. The law contained a provision that would define drug policy for the next quarter century. 5 grams of crack carried the same mandatory minimum sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine. 100 to 1. Same drug, same molecule. 2 chemical forms, 2 delivery methods, 2 price points, 2 very different demographic profiles of who was being arrested for each version. Nobody asked the obvious question out loud. Several people asked it in writing. The writing was filed in congressional records where it remains, accurately predicting consequences that then occurred exactly as predicted. The law passed anyway. The chemistry, for what it's worth, is almost insultingly simple. Powder cocaine dissolves in water. Crack is cocaine converted to freebase form by mixing with baking soda and water, then heating and drying. The result makes a crackling sound when smoked. That's where the name comes from. Not the high. The noise. Your grandmother has everything needed to make crack cocaine in her kitchen right now. The recipe is simpler than brownies. The entire innovation that reshaped American cities and filled American prisons for a generation required a box of baking soda and basic heat. What changes is the speed. Snorting powder delivers the drug through nasal tissue. 3 to 5 minutes to peak effect. High lasting 20 to 30 minutes. Smoking delivers it through the lungs directly to the brain in approximately 8 to 10 seconds. Faster onset, more intense initial hit, much shorter duration, and the faster and more intense the hit, the more powerful the neurological drive to repeat it the moment it fades. Think about what that means practically. A powder cocaine user might use once and feel the effect for half an hour. A crack user might feel the peak for 5 to 10 minutes, feel the crash almost immediately, and want more within 15 minutes of the first hit. The reinforcement cycle is compressed to the point where the interval between use and craving is shorter than a television commercial break. The business model from a dealer's perspective was extraordinary. The biology had done the marketing. A dose of powder cocaine in 1985 cost roughly $100. A single crack rock cost $5 to $10. Cocaine had been a country club. Crack was a drive-through window. Same product, new price point, entire new customer base. If crack had been a legitimate business, Harvard would be teaching case studies about its distribution model. It achieved near-complete national coverage in 3 years with no advertising budget, no logo, and complete illegal status. Starbucks took 20 years to reach all 50 states. The communities crack entered first were not random. They were the communities that deindustrialization had already hollowed out. American cities in the late 70s and early 80s where manufacturing had left. The tax base had contracted, the social infrastructure had deteriorated, and young people had fewer legitimate economic paths than their parents had navigated. The South Bronx, South Central Los Angeles, Detroit, Baltimore, Newark, Philadelphia. These were not places the expensive powder form had reached. Crack reached them now because the price had been brought within reach. The crack trade offered those communities an economic structure, not a stable one, not a humane one, but a structure when alternatives were genuinely scarce. A teenager in South Central in 1986 could look at the crack economy and see a hierarchy with entry points, with the possibility of advancement, with income that was, relative to what was otherwise available, real. The corner was the business. The business had operational logistics and competitive dynamics and a compensation structure. It also had a body count. The violence was real. The addiction was real. The devastation to families was real and documented and ongoing. People who grew up in those communities in the late 80s and early 90s describe what crack did to the social fabric with a specificity that no outside account can match. The older women who disappeared, the fathers who weren't there, the teenagers who were present 1 month and incarcerated or dead the next. But crack arrived into communities that had already been structurally compromised. The drug accelerated something. It did not create it from nothing. The national conversation described this as a drug problem, as a failure of individual choices that could be addressed by changing the choices, through advertising, through incarceration, through the particular American conviction that if enough people said no loudly enough, the problem would eventually agree to leave. The structural analysis, the deindustrialization, the housing policy, the deliberate disinvestment, the decades of specific choices that had produced the conditions crack accelerated, was available in academic literature and city budget documents to anyone sufficiently motivated to read it. It was less politically convenient than the drug problem framing. It required more to fix, and the fixing would cost more than mandatory minimum sentences. The people who would have to fund the fixing were not the people experiencing the consequences. Congress found this arrangement acceptable. The arrangement lasted for decades. It is, in several respects, still ongoing. The 100-to-1 sentencing ratio was not a secret provision buried in fine print. It was voted on by the full House, by the full Senate, with bipartisan support in a political environment where the crack epidemic was producing genuinely alarming images, devastated neighborhoods, addicted mothers, a generation of children growing up in communities where the violence and the drug were inseparable, and where the political cost of appearing insufficiently alarmed was higher than the political cost of appearing insufficiently thoughtful. There were voices, including black legislators, who raised concerns at the time about the demographic consequences of treating crack and powder differently. There were civil liberties organisations. There were legal scholars who published their analyses of what the 100-to-1 ratio would predictably produce given who was being arrested for each form of the drug. The law passed anyway, in weeks. Federal prosecution data from the late 80s through the 90s showed crack cocaine prosecutions as overwhelmingly black defendants, powder cocaine prosecutions as demographically mixed with significant white representation. The sentences were mandatory minimums, no judicial discretion, no ability to account for individual circumstances. 5 grams of crack meant 5 years. 5 grams of crack is about the weight of a nickel. To be specific about what that means, a judge who believed a sentence was unjust could not change it. A judge who had spent 20 years on the bench and understood, better than anyone in the room, that the person in front of them was not a danger to anyone and had already served a meaningful purpose by being prosecuted. That judge had to give the mandatory sentence anyway. The law had removed their discretion. Congress had decided the formula was better than the judgment. The sentencing disparity stood for 24 years. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 reduced it to 18-to-1, not 1-to-1, 18-to-1. Congress looked at 100-to-1 disparity with documented racial consequences running for a quarter century and concluded that 18 times more punishment for the same drug in a different form was the appropriate calibration. The reasoning behind the specific number does not appear in the legislative record. Presumably someone had a calculator. Between 1980 and 2000, the US prison population quadrupled. Drug convictions were a primary driver, the molecule that had promised effortless success to surgeons and stockbrokers, and the Pope was now delivering 5-year mandatory minimums to people for whom the $5 rock had been the only version of that promise they could afford. While all of this was unfolding in American cities, Colombia was having a different kind of problem. Pablo Escobar did not want to be extradited to the United States. This was understandable from his perspective. American federal courts did not share the Colombian government's flexible relationship with his requests, and American federal prisons did not allow jacuzzis. He expressed his preference the way he expressed most preferences, by making the alternative as painful as possible for anyone in a position to make it happen. He called the campaign War on Extradition. It was accurate advertising. The Colombian justice minister was killed in 1984, shot by assassins on motorcycles in Bogotá. This was Escobar's opening position in the negotiation. Clear, unambiguous. The Colombian government, which had been moving toward an extradition treaty with the United States, received it as the clarification it was. 3 presidential candidates followed. Luis Carlos Galán, killed at a campaign rally in 1989, Bernardo Jaramillo Ossa, killed in 1990, Carlos Pizarro León Gómez, killed in 1990. Escobar was not expressing a partisan preference. He was expressing a preference about extradition. He applied it regardless of party. He bombed the DA's headquarters in Bogotá in December 1989. 52 people killed, more than 1,000 wounded. He placed a bomb on Avianca Flight 203 in November 1989, killing all 107 people aboard in an attempt to kill a presidential candidate who had been rescheduled off that flight. The candidate survived. 107 other people did not. The bomb did not distinguish between its intended target and everyone else. Escobar considered this acceptable. At the peak of his campaign against police, Medellin saw the killing of officers become an organized industry. Escobar paid bounties. Young men from the city's hillside comunas, the neighborhoods that had been left behind by whatever development had occurred, in the valley, were recruited as assassins. Some were teenagers. The DEA's internal estimates suggest his organisation killed approximately 3,000 to 4,000 people during his peak years of operation. He was also, during the same period, one of the most popular figures in some of the poorest parts of Colombia. He built football fields. He funded housing. He was photographed with neighbourhood children. The communities whose young men he recruited as assassins were also the communities that described him, in some accounts, as the only powerful person who had ever done anything for them. History rarely gives you a clean villain. This one in particular did not cooperate with the format. When Escobar negotiated his surrender to Colombian authorities in 1991, he specified the terms with the directness of someone who understood exactly what leverage he had. He would surrender. But he would be held in a facility of his own design, staffed with guards of his own choosing, in a location near his hometown. The Colombian government agreed to this. There are several ways to read that decision. Most of them are unflattering to the Colombian government. The facility was called La Catedral. It sat on a hill above Envigado with a view of the valley. It had a soccer field, a bar, a jacuzzi, a sauna, and a discotheque. Escobar reportedly continued conducting cartel operations from inside La Catedral, hosting business meetings, managing shipments, running an international drug trafficking operation from a prison built to the specifications of the man being imprisoned. Colombian government officials who attempted to inspect the facility were turned away at the gate by the guards that Escobar had chosen. This was the prison. He escaped in July 1992 when word reached him, through channels suggesting remarkable penetration of the government's planning, that the authorities intended to transfer him to an actual prison. He walked out. The guards let him. He spent the next 16 months as a fugitive, hunted by Colombian special forces working alongside American intelligence. He was located because he kept calling his family. Mobile phone calls from specific locations can be triangulated. The signal's intelligence capacity of the American agencies assisting the hunt was sufficient to narrow his position to a specific house in a Medellin suburb. He was shot on the roof of that house on December 2nd, 1993. He was 44 years old. His family now operates a business offering paid tours of properties associated with his life and death. The tours are popular. The same neighbourhoods that buried his victims pay to visit the sites. History has a sense of humour about these things, though it is not always a comfortable one. While Escobar was still running operations from his custom-built prison, a journalist in California was working on a story that wouldn't be published for years and wouldn't be fully acknowledged as accurate for several more. Gary Webb was an investigative reporter with a specific interest in where the crack cocaine flooding south-central Los Angeles had come from, and whether any US government institutions had been aware of, or complicit in, its arrival. It was the kind of question that, if you asked it in 1994, made certain people very uncomfortable. Webb noticed this. He kept asking. His 1996 story in the San Jose Mercury News, called Dark Alliance, documented relationships between Nicaraguan Contra rebels, CIA-connected networks, and cocaine trafficking into American cities. The Contras were the anti-communist rebel group the Reagan administration had been supporting covertly. Covertly because Congress had passed the Boland Amendment restricting direct US support. The CIA maintained relationships with various Contra-adjacent figures, some of whom had cocaine trafficking connections. Webb documented that some of those connections had channeled product into American distribution networks, including the networks feeding south-central Los Angeles. The story ran on the front page. The Mercury News published it simultaneously in print and online, an early and significant use of the internet for investigative journalism. It reached a large audience quickly. That audience included people who'd been watching their communities destroyed by crack cocaine for a decade and had their own questions about where it came from. The major newspapers reviewed his reporting. The Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post all publish pieces largely critical of his methodology and conclusions. Editors at those papers assigned multiple reporters to find holes in Webb's work. They found some. They did not find that his core claim, that CIA-connected figures had relationships with cocaine traffickers whose product reached American cities, was false. They reported it as false anyway, or close enough to false that the distinction was not immediately obvious to readers. Webb's career at the Mercury News ended. He was transferred to a minor bureau and resigned. In 1998, the Inspector General of the CIA published an internal investigation into the agency's Contra-era drug relationships. The report concluded the agency had been aware of drug trafficking by Contra-associated assets and had consistently failed to report this to law enforcement as required. The report confirmed, in substance, considerably more of Webb's core claims than the major newspapers had. The major newspapers did not publish prominent corrections. They had moved on to other things. The Inspector General's report was available to anyone who wanted to find it. Not many people looked. Webb died in December 2004 in his Sacramento home, 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The coroner ruled it a suicide. The ruling stands. The major newspapers ran obituaries. Several acknowledged in retrospect that his reporting had been more accurate than their original coverage had suggested. This acknowledgement came after his death, which is the kind of timing that tells you something about how these things work. The DEA received news of Escobar's death in 1993 as a significant victory. The press releases said so. Senior officials appeared on television and described it as a turning point. The cocaine supply did not receive this information. Within months, the Cali cartel, which had been operating alongside Medellin throughout the 80s with a notably more corporate management style, structured organizational charts, professional accounting, and a lower preference for bombing things, absorbed the disrupted routes. The Cali approach to business was less theatrical than Escobar's. They bribed judges instead of killing them where possible. They cultivated political relationships rather than assassinating politicians where possible. They were, by the standards of the international cocaine trade, relatively reasonable people to do business with. The DEA dismantled their leadership between 1995 and 1997. The supply chain restructured again. This is what supply chains do when the commodity is something a very large number of people want and will pay for. They restructure quickly, efficiently, and with the operational resilience of an organization that has been watching its competition fail and drawing conclusions. The Mexican trafficking organizations, which had been working as transportation subcontractors for Colombian cocaine, paid in cash or in product to move supply through Mexico and across the American border, had been watching the Colombian organizations for years. They had learned from Escobar's mistakes. Less visibility, less violence where violence could be avoided, more attention to the corruption of officials rather than their elimination, more sophisticated tunneling infrastructure under the American border. When the Colombian organizations weakened, the Mexican organizations were ready to step in. They had been preparing. Within a decade, the Sinaloa organization under Joaquin Guzman, known as El Chapo, a nickname meaning shorty, which is the kind of name that acquires a different texture when you understand what it belongs to. The Tijuana cartel, the Zetas, and other Mexican organizations held the primary infrastructure of the American cocaine market. The geography of the supply chain had shifted 2,000 miles north. The supply chain itself had not changed in any fundamental way. The war on drugs had been declared in 1971. The DEA had been established in 1973. Escobar was dead, the Cali cartel was being dismantled, Plan Colombia was being drafted with American funding. Cocaine production in Colombia was at record highs within a decade of Escobar's death. The farms were still there. The farmers had the same economic calculation they always had. coca paid better than any alternative the Colombian government could consistently offer. When aerial herbicides sprayed their crops they replanted, sometimes in harder-to-reach areas, sometimes using more efficient strains developed precisely for high-yield production in difficult terrain. The farmers were not ideologically committed to cocaine, they were committed to feeding their families. The herbicide did not change that calculation. The war on drugs, as applied to cocaine, had spent 20 years and several $100 billion achieving a situation in which cocaine was cheaper, more pure, and more widely available than when it started. The street price of cocaine in the United States fell by approximately 80% between 1980 and 2000, adjusted for purity. More product, lower price, higher quality. By any conventional measure of a market's health, the cocaine market in 2000 was thriving. The enforcement had served functionally as a quality filter, eliminating less efficient operations and leaving the more sophisticated ones to grow. The war had been won, announced and won again in press releases. The market had not been informed, it continued operating. Meanwhile, the financial system that the cocaine trade had been running through for 2 decades was about to have its own kind of reckoning. The cocaine was illegal, the money had to go somewhere, and the somewhere, it turned out, was a very recognizable set of institutions with very recognizable logos on the door. The cocaine trade has always had a money problem, not a shortage of money, the opposite. The problem is that the money exists and cannot be explained. A person who sells cocaine for 20 years and accumulates, say, $30 billion, as Pablo Escobar did, cannot walk into a bank and deposit $30 billion. Banks ask questions. Banks are required in most countries to ask questions. The Bank Secrecy Act in the United States requires financial institutions to report cash transactions over $10,000 and to flag suspicious patterns. The equivalent exists in most developed economies. The solution is money laundering. The process of taking money that came from crime and running it through legitimate channels until it emerges clean on the other side, documented and explainable. Shell companies, real estate purchases, cash-intensive businesses, offshore accounts in jurisdictions with minimal reporting requirements. The cocaine trade generates so much cash, physical paper cash, that Pablo Escobar reportedly budgeted $2,500 a month on rubber bands alone, just to bundle the bills he couldn't move fast enough to deposit. The money had to go somewhere. Where it went, it turns out, was familiar. In 2012, HSBC, one of the largest banks in the world, headquartered in London, with operations in 67 countries, agreed to pay $1.9 billion to settle US federal charges that it had laundered hundreds of millions of dollars for Mexican and Colombian drug cartels, including cocaine trafficking organizations. The settlement was the largest in US banking history at the time. No individual HSBC employee went to prison. The Department of Justice, in the documents explaining why it had not pursued criminal charges against individual executives, noted concerns about the systemic consequences of prosecuting a bank of HSBC's size, the risk that a criminal conviction could threaten the bank's operating licenses, which could threaten financial stability more broadly. The technical legal term for this reasoning is too big to jail, which is not an official legal doctrine but which appears in enough government documents and congressional testimony from this period to constitute something close to working policy. To understand what HSBC had done, in concrete terms, the Sinaloa cartel had moved billions of dollars through HSBC accounts. The Cayman Island subsidiary had moved money for the Norte del Valle cartel. HSBC had maintained accounts for Saudi Arabian banks with known terrorist financing connections. The bank's anti-money laundering compliance department had been chronically understaffed and under-resourced for years, not accidentally, according to Senate investigators, but as a cost management decision. At one point, the backlog of unreviewed accounts flagged for suspicious activity reached 17,000. HSBC paid the fine, not a fine, levied against individual executives. A fine paid from the bank's own operating funds, from profits accumulated in part while providing the services in question. The executives responsible for the relevant compliance decisions kept their jobs for most of the relevant period. Some kept their bonuses. The bank continued operating. Wachovia Bank, which was acquired by Wells Fargo in 2008 and now operates under that name, was the subject of a separate money laundering investigation that produced results in 2010. The bank had processed approximately $378 billion in transactions for Mexican currency exchange houses that were, the investigation found, conduits for cocaine cartel proceeds. $378 billion. Wachovia paid a settlement of $160 million. No individual faced criminal charges. The settlement was structured as a deferred prosecution agreement, meaning that if the bank complied with monitoring requirements for a specified period, the charges would be dropped. The bank complied. The charges were dropped. $160 million is roughly 0.04% of $378 billion. It is, to use the technical financial term, a rounding error. The ratio of settlement to laundered funds is the financial equivalent of a speeding ticket for someone who drove their car through a shopping mall. The financial system did not have a cocaine problem in the way that the people in the prisons had a cocaine problem. The financial system had a cocaine relationship, a mutually beneficial arrangement in which the cocaine trade provided revenue, and the financial system provided the laundering infrastructure that made those revenues usable. The arrangement was illegal. The consequences, when they arrived, were structured to be manageable, profitable even on balance. Plan Colombia was launched in 1999, a bilateral agreement between the US and Colombian governments that committed approximately $7.5 billion in US funding over its initial decade, primarily for counter-narcotics operations, military assistance, and, most visibly, aerial eradication of coca crops. The aerial eradication program worked like this. Planes flew over coca-growing regions of Colombia and sprayed glyphosate, a herbicide, on the crops below. The crops died. The farmers who grew them, people who had been growing coca because coca paid better than the alternatives the Colombian agricultural economy could offer them, which was not a new situation and had not been changed by Plan Colombia, watched their crops die. Then they replanted. This is not a surprising outcome in retrospect or in prospect for anyone who had spent 10 minutes considering the economics. The price of coca remained attractive. The legitimate agricultural alternatives, the legal crops that Plan Colombia theoretically offered farmers as substitution, paid less and had less reliable markets. The replanting occurs because the calculation that led to the planting has not changed. Sometimes the replanting happens in harder-to-access regions that aerial surveillance doesn't reach efficiently. Sometimes it happens with strains developed specifically for higher yield per plant, so that the same area produces more cocaine than before the eradication program. Sometimes both. The Colombian government's own data showed that coca cultivation rebounded within 1 to 2 growing seasons of major eradication efforts, consistently across multiple years of the program. The US State Department tracked this. The numbers were in the reports. The program continued. The people running Plan Colombia were not stupid. They were operating within a political framework that valued demonstrating action over evaluating outcomes, and within an alliance where stopping would have required explaining publicly why. The program isn't working is a difficult press release to issue when the program is your signature foreign policy initiative, jointly announced with a close ally, funded at $7.5 billion. So the spraying continued. In 2017, the US State Department certified that Colombia had reached an all-time record in coca cultivation. This was approximately 18 years into a program whose stated purpose was reducing coca cultivation. The certification was issued as a matter of routine reporting. Nobody resigned. The United States government has never met a drug problem it couldn't make worse. This isn't cynicism. At this point, it is documented pattern matching against a very large data set that spans 5 decades, multiple administrations, and several $100 billion in enforcement spending. What did work, somewhat, was the mid-1990s disruption of the major Colombian cartel structures. The Cali cartel, the Medellin cartel's more professionally managed competitor, the one with the organizational charts and the lawyers and the preference for corruption over bombing, was largely dismantled by Colombian authorities between 1995 and 1997. Its top leadership was arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. Some cooperated with authorities in exchange for reduced sentences, which generated its own controversy, and which produced intelligence about the cartel's operations that the DEA found genuinely valuable. The operation was considered a significant law enforcement success. What replaced the Cali cartel was not the absence of cocaine. It was a more fragmented supply landscape. Dozens of smaller Colombian trafficking organizations, none of them powerful enough to operate with the political leverage of the major cartels, but collectively capable of maintaining and eventually exceeding cocaine production. The fragmentation made enforcement harder, not easier. Targeting Escobar had required years and enormous resources but produced a single decisive outcome. Targeting 40 smaller organizations requires 40 separate operations, 40 separate intelligence builds, 40 separate prosecutions simultaneously. The DEA's budget did not scale with the fragmentation. The Mexican trafficking organizations absorbed the distribution function that Colombian cartels had previously managed. By the early 2000s, the infrastructure for moving cocaine from Colombia to the United States was primarily Mexican. The Colombian organizations produced, the Mexican organizations transported, distributed, and increasingly retained a larger share of the margin. The shift of power from Colombian to Mexican trafficking was one of the most consequential reorganizations in the history of drug trafficking, and it happened, in large part, as a direct consequence of successful enforcement actions against the Colombian cartels. You dismantle the organization you know. What replaces it is the organization you don't. Cocaine's retail price in the United States in the early 2000s was lower than it had been in 1980. Purity was higher, availability was comparable or better. By standard economic measures, the market for cocaine in 2005 was in better commercial health than the market in 1985, which was the year the Reagan administration declared its most dramatic escalation of anti-cocaine enforcement. The decades of enforcement had, by the standard measures of the market itself, produced cheaper, purer, more accessible cocaine. This is the economic outcome of supply-side drug policy applied to a commodity with inelastic demand and inexhaustible supply-side incentives. The math was available to anyone who wanted to do it. Economists published it. Law enforcement agencies received the reports. The policy continued. The financial side of the cocaine trade's legitimization continued in smaller ways that don't make the $1.9 billion settlements but collectively constitute the infrastructure of how the money moves. Real estate, cash-intensive businesses, car washes, restaurants, parking lots, nightclubs that can absorb irregular revenue and produce invoices that look like commerce because they are, technically, also commerce. Shell companies in Delaware, in the British Virgin Islands, in Panama, in the Cayman Islands, in Luxembourg, jurisdictions specifically selected because their disclosure requirements are minimal and their legal protections are maximal. The lawyer who sets up the shell company is not required, in most of these jurisdictions to ask what it's for. The accountant who processes the invoices is not required to inquire into the origin of the cash. The real estate agent who closes the purchase is not, in the United States, subject to the same anti-money laundering due diligence requirements that apply to banks. This was not an accident. The exemption of real estate from anti-money laundering requirements was a regulatory decision. The exemption of lawyers from reporting requirements when they set up shell companies was a lobbying outcome. The jurisdictions that offer maximum financial secrecy are not operating without awareness of what that secrecy enables. They are offering it as a service, explicitly, and being compensated for it in the form of the financial flows that the secrecy attracts. The cocaine economy, at scale, is not primarily a street corner economy. It is a financial architecture. The street corners are the retail end of a supply chain that runs from a coca farm in the Huallaga Valley to a processing facility in the Colombian jungle to a Mexican distribution network to an American city, and then, on the money side, backward through a series of legitimate-looking transactions that convert drug proceeds into something that can be held in a bank account and eventually spent. The architecture uses familiar components, real estate, particularly in cities with strong foreign buyer markets, where cash purchases are common and due diligence requirements are minimal. Cash-intensive businesses, car washes, restaurants, parking lots, nightclubs, businesses that can absorb irregular revenue and produce invoices that look like commerce because they are technically also commerce. Shell companies in Delaware, in the British Virgin Islands, in Panama, in the Cayman Islands, jurisdiction selected because their disclosure requirements are minimal and their legal protections are maximal. The lawyer who sets up the shell company is not required in most of these jurisdictions to ask what it's for. The accountant who processes the invoices is not required to inquire into the origin of the cash. The real estate agent who closes the purchase is not, in the United States, subject to the same anti-money laundering due diligence requirements that apply to banks. These exemptions were not accidents. They were lobbying outcomes, regulatory decisions, and the product of jurisdictions that offer financial secrecy as a service and are compensated for it by the flows that secrecy attracts. Every step of this architecture requires services, legal services, accounting services, banking services, real estate services, insurance sometimes, shipping regularly. None of these service providers are, in the most literal legal sense, the cocaine trade. They are the infrastructure the cocaine trade needs to function at scale, and they are, in a significant number of documented cases, providing those services knowingly. The cocaine itself was also changing in ways the buyers didn't know about. Levomersole is an antiparasitic medication used in veterinary medicine, primarily for deworming cattle and sheep. It has been used in humans as a cancer chemotherapy drug. It has significant immunological side effects in a minority of people who take it, including a condition called a granulocytosis, a collapse of white blood cell production that leaves the immune system unable to respond to infection. Beginning in the 2000s, levomersole began appearing in cocaine samples. By the 2010s, it was present in the majority of cocaine analyzed in North America. Estimates from the US Drug Enforcement Administration suggest it appeared in 70 to 80% of samples. It appeared in the cocaine as it left Colombia. Nobody in the supply chain told the buyers. The reason levomersole is in cocaine has to do with the economics of cocaine processing. Levomersole is cheap. It appears to enhance cocaine's stimulant effects through mechanisms that are not fully understood. It has the physical properties, white powder, soluble, to be blended into cocaine without detection by casual examination. Processing facilities in Colombia appear to have begun adding it as a standard adulterant at some point in the early to mid-2000s. Because the cocaine moved through multiple hands before reaching a buyer in North America, each of those hands was unaware of or indifferent to what the previous hand had added. The cocaine supply chain was not, in this sense, unusual. It shared this feature with many global food supply chains, with less legal standing and more immediate consequences. The medical consequences emerged gradually in case reports from hematologists and emergency physicians. A patient with severe immune suppression, a history of cocaine use, bone marrow examination showing a granulocytosis, the connection to levamisole made, the same pattern appearing in other patients, a case series, published. A public health alert issued. The buyer still weren't told. The public health alerts existed. They were not distributed at point of sale, for reasons that should be obvious. This is the cocaine supply chain as it actually functioned in the early 21st century, a product of unknown purity, unknown adulterants, and unknown immunological risk, sold with the same confidence and cultural baggage it had been sold with for 100 years. The buyer thought they were buying cocaine. They were buying cocaine plus whatever the supply chain had added between Colombia and their hands. The levamisole was the quiet version of this problem. The fentanyl was about to be something considerably less quiet. Between 1980 and 2000, the United States prison population increased from roughly 500,000 to approximately 2 million. The United States, which has about 4% of the world's population, now holds roughly 25% of the world's incarcerated people. This is not a coincidence of criminal activity. It is the product of specific policy choices, of which mandatory minimum drug sentences are among the most significant. The people filling those prisons were not, in the main, the financial architects of the cocaine trade. They were not the bankers who processed the cartel funds. They were not the lawyers who set up the shell companies. They were not the executives whose compliance departments let 17,000 suspicious accounts go unreviewed. Those people were, for the most part, in their offices. The people in the prisons were disproportionately black, disproportionately poor, disproportionately from the communities that crack cocaine had devastated, serving mandatory sentences for drug quantities that the people who designed the sentences had specifically calibrated to reach those communities and not the communities with the powder cocaine. This is not a secret of history. This was documented in real time. The Senate Judiciary Committee had the data. The academic literature had the data. The data was published. The sentences stood. The prisons filled. The cocaine continued flowing at record volumes through the financial infrastructure that the sentences were not designed to address, into the communities that the sentences were designed to reach, with consequences that continued accumulating. Through the late 1990s and early 2000s, cocaine's cultural visibility in the United States began to diminish, not its use, its visibility. The crack epidemic had peaked by the mid-1990s and begun a statistical decline, not because the drug disappeared, but because the communities most devastated had reached a grim kind of equilibrium, because the worst of the visible violence had abated, because the media cycle moved on to other urgencies. Crack cocaine was still present in American cities. It was no longer the lead story. Powder cocaine persisted among middle and upper income users with a consistency that generated no particular legislative attention. Emergency department data from the late 1990s showed a significant percentage of cocaine-related hospital presentations were white, employed, and insured. This information was published. It did not produce congressional hearings. The drug was also facing new competition for the same markets. Methamphetamine was cheaper, longer lasting, and becoming available through supply chains that didn't require the Colombian to Mexican to American transport infrastructure. It could be made domestically, in rural communities, with chemicals purchased at hardware stores and farm supply shops. The market for stimulants was expanding. Cocaine's share of that market was being contested for the first time since amphetamines had displaced it in the 1930s. Prescription opioids, OxyContin arrived in 1996, were providing a different kind of gap-closing experience to a different demographic through a distribution network with more than 2,000 pharmaceutical sales representatives and the credibility of FDA approval. The sedative economy and the stimulant economy were both growing. Cocaine was one player in a much more crowded field. It persisted. It found European cities where the cultural arc had not included the crack epidemic, where the drug's sophisticated adult image remained more intact, where rising incomes and changing social norms were creating a market that looked increasingly like America in 1978. Rotterdam became one of the primary entry points for cocaine into Europe. The quantities arriving were large. The European market, by some estimates, was approaching or exceeding the American market in total consumption by the 2010s. In the United States, the cocaine supply chain was still running, cheaper than before, more pure than before, still employing the same financial architecture, still generating the same cash that needed laundering, still producing the same gap between who was incarcerated and who was not. And in that supply chain, something was changing that the buyers had not been told about. A different drug, cheaper, more potent, far more lethal, was making its way into the cocaine supply as a contaminant, as an adulterant, as a consequence of the same equipment and the same hands processing multiple substances in the same facilities. The people who bought cocaine thought they were buying cocaine. Some of them were getting something else, and it was killing them in ways that cocaine alone, in the doses they were accustomed to, had never killed people so quickly. The accounting that cocaine had always run in the background, the one that had never been disclosed up front, the one that arrived when people stopped, when the gap reopened, when the dopamine ran out, had just acquired a new item, one that didn't wait for the crash. It arrived with a drug. The same molecule that had benumbed Niemann's tongue in 1860, that had sat in the Pope's flask in 1890, that had closed. The gap for Freud's friend and for every Wall Street trader and for everyone who ever walked out of a Tuesday meeting feeling like the best version of themselves. That molecule was now being delivered alongside something that killed in minutes, in people who had no tolerance for it, with no warning and no antidote in their pocket. The drug that had always promised the gap would close was now, sometimes, keeping a different promise entirely. The fentanyl problem arrived quietly in forensic data. Cocaine involved overdose deaths in the United States in 2013, approximately 5,000. Cocaine involved overdose deaths in the United States in 2021, 24,486. The drug didn't get more dangerous. The supply chain did. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, roughly 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine by weight. It was designed by Paul Janssen in 1960 for surgical anesthesia, and it remains one of the most medically useful drugs in existence. In illicit form, it is the primary driver of American overdose deaths in the current era. It is measured not in grams, but in micrograms, millionths of a gram, and the difference between a dose that produces sedation and a dose that stops breathing is small enough that the imprecision of street-level distribution is itself lethal. Fentanyl entered the cocaine supply through two routes. The first is cross-contamination. The same equipment, the same processing facilities, the same hands that handle fentanyl for distribution also handle cocaine, and the residue moves between the substances without anyone being particularly careful about keeping them separate. The second is deliberate adulteration. Fentanyl is dramatically cheaper per dose than cocaine, and adding it to cocaine lowers the per unit cost, while producing effects that some users describe as enhanced. The people who die are the ones without opioid tolerance. A person who uses cocaine recreationally, someone who has never used opioids, whose body has no tolerance for opioid chemistry, encounters a fentanyl-contaminated cocaine line and their breathing stops. Fast. Naloxone reverses it, but naloxone has to be there, and the person has to still be alive when it arrives, and fentanyl works in minutes. The window between use and death can be shorter than the time it takes for someone in the next room to notice something is wrong. This is not a hypothetical. The CDC tracks it. The increase from 5,000 to 24,000 cocaine-involved overdose deaths between 2013 and 2021 is substantially attributable to fentanyl contamination. People who thought they were using cocaine recreationally, people who had managed cocaine's risks for years, who understood what they were doing, who were not using opioids and had no reason to carry naloxone, died from something that had been added to the drug they thought they were buying, without their knowledge, by a supply chain that had no mechanism for disclosure and no incentive to develop one. The drug that had always presented a hidden accounting, that had always been quietly accumulating charges in the background, while the user felt capable and focused and finally enough, had added a new line item. This one didn't wait for the crash. The people who die of fentanyl-contaminated cocaine are not, in the main, opioid users who know what they're taking. They are cocaine users. People who made a specific choice about what drug they were going to use, based on decades of known risk profiles, based on their understanding of what cocaine does and doesn't do to a body. The cocaine they bought was not what they bought. The supply chain had made a substitution, partial, invisible, potentially lethal, and handed them the product without disclosure. Cocaine testing strips exist. Fentanyl testing strips exist. They are cheap, accurate, and available in many harm reduction programs. They are illegal in several American states. Some states classify them as drug paraphernalia, the same category as needles and pipes, and their possession or distribution is a criminal offense. The people dying from fentanyl-contaminated cocaine could, with a fentanyl testing strip, have known their cocaine was contaminated. The tool exists. The knowledge exists. The policy in some jurisdictions makes the tool illegal. This is, to use the precise term, a policy choice. It is a choice that prioritizes a particular legal and moral framework over a particular set of human lives. The people who made the choice know that people die because of it. This information is available to them. The policy continues. The molecule is still in operating rooms. Cocaine hydrochloride solution, the actual drug, the alkaloid isolated by Albert Niemann in 1860, is still used by ear, nose, and throat surgeons as a topical anesthetic and vasoconstrictor for nasal and sinus procedures. It remains the only single compound that simultaneously numbs tissue and constricts blood vessels in the same application, which is a genuinely useful combination in surgeries where both functions matter simultaneously. Lidocaine has replaced cocaine in most surgical applications, and lidocaine plus a vasoconstrictor can replicate the effect. But for certain nasal procedures, cocaine remains the cleaner option. Cocaine is classified as a Schedule I substance in the United States, the most restricted category in federal drug law, reserved for substances with high abuse potential and no accepted medical use. The Schedule I classification is also the legal basis for cocaine's prohibition. You cannot legally possess it, sell it, or use it without specific federal authorization because it has no accepted medical use, except in operating rooms, where it does, where it is used routinely under a separate approval framework by surgeons who have the specific certifications, the same molecule, the same compound, no accepted medical use until you need it for nasal surgery, at which point it is accepted medical use. The DEA manages this through a separate medical cocaine scheduling track that exists alongside the Schedule I classification. The contradiction between no accepted medical use and accepted medical use in these specific circumstances is not resolved. It is administered. Nobody filed a lawsuit about it. It has been true for long enough to become uncontroversial. Europe's cocaine moment arrived approximately 30 years after America's. Rotterdam and Antwerp became the primary entry points for cocaine into Europe, container ports large enough and with shipping volumes significant enough that comprehensive inspection of incoming cargo was not operationally feasible. Cocaine arrived in fruit shipments from Ecuador and Colombia, in chemical containers, in bulk cargo that required X-ray scanning equipment and trained inspectors and the kind of staffing that the ports did not have in sufficient numbers to check everything. When you move the volume of goods that Rotterdam and Antwerp moved daily, a 1% inspection rate leaves 99% unexamined. The cartels understood this. The routing shifted. The Caribbean routes that had served the American market in the 1980s were supplemented and eventually partially supplanted by the Atlantic routes to European ports. The logistics were different. The economics were the same. Cocaine seizures at European ports hit record highs in 2021, 2022, 2023. The amounts being seized were large enough to generate the records. The amounts not being seized were larger. Europol estimates that the European cocaine market consumes somewhere between 200 and 400 metric tons per year, numbers that carry wide confidence intervals because the thing being measured is illegal and therefore not accurately reported. The cultural experience of cocaine in major European cities, in London, in Amsterdam, in Madrid, in Berlin, in Antwerp itself, looked, by the 2000s, like the American experience of the 1970s, normalized among young professionals, present at social events without particular stigma, discussed in the way alcohol is discussed, expensive enough to carry status, not expensive enough to be inaccessible. The crack epidemic had not happened in Europe in the same way. The racial panic that had shaped American cocaine criminalization did not have a European structural equivalent. The drug arrived into a cultural context where the framework for it had not been built around the images that crack cocaine had burned into American political consciousness. Some European countries responded differently. Portugal decriminalized all drug use in 2001, cocaine included, and redirected the enforcement savings into treatment and harm reduction infrastructure. Drug-related deaths fell measurably. HIV transmission among drug users fell. Drug use rates did not significantly increase, which challenged the argument that criminalization suppresses use. The cocaine was still there. The approach had changed. Portugal's government did not receive a Nobel Prize for this. They received primarily criticism from countries whose approach was producing worse outcomes. The Netherlands operates harm reduction infrastructure, drug checking services that allow users to test their cocaine for adulterants, without criminal consequences for the testing. This service saves lives. It is not a statement about whether cocaine use is advisable. It is a statement about the gap between cocaine being illegal and cocaine being gone, and the policy choice about what to do in that gap. Colombia's cocaine story has no clean ending. President Gustavo Petro, elected in 2022 as Colombia's first left-wing president, a former guerrilla member who had spent decades in opposition politics, came to office with a position on cocaine that departed significantly from 50 years of enforced eradication. His approach: negotiate with coca farmers rather than spray their crops, offer genuine economic alternatives, pursue the trafficking organizations at the institutional level rather than targeting the agricultural base they depend on but did not create. This was not a radical idea in policy terms. Economists, public health researchers, and former law enforcement officials had been arguing versions of it since the 1980s. It was radical in political terms because it required a Colombian president to say, essentially, that the approach the United States had funded at several $billion was not working, had not worked, and would not work, and that Colombia was going to try something different. The United States received this assessment with the enthusiasm that powerful nations typically display when told their signature foreign policy initiative was a failure. The results are genuinely mixed. Coca cultivation in Colombia remained at historically high levels through Petro's first years in office. The legitimate economic alternatives, the crops that would pay something close to what coca pays, with the markets and infrastructure to make them viable, take years to establish and are not yet established. What the approach represents, regardless of outcome, is an acknowledgement, rare in official policy, that 60 years of supply-side enforcement had produced the situation Colombia was in, and that the farmers growing coca were not the problem. They were people responding rationally to available options. Changing their behavior required changing the options. This analysis had been available since roughly 1985. It took until 2022 for a Colombian president to act on it officially. There are, as of the 2020s, approximately 4 to 5 million cocaine users in the United States in a given year, according to National Survey on Drug Use and Health data. There are several million more in Europe. There are millions in South America, in Australia, in West Africa, in the networks of transit countries through which cocaine moves on its way to the final markets. The global cocaine market is estimated at somewhere between $80 and $100 billion annually. This makes it one of the larger commodity markets in the world. It operates without stock listings, without shareholder meetings, without annual reports, without the regulatory infrastructure that governs legal commodity markets. It operates with a supply chain discipline and financial sophistication that rival any legal industry, and with enforcement directed at it by dozens of national governments simultaneously, and in the face of that enforcement it has consistently maintained and expanded production. For perspective, the global cocaine market is roughly the same size as the global coffee market. Coffee employs about 125 million people in a legal supply chain with traceable origins, fair trade certifications, and barista training courses. Cocaine employs a different set of people in a supply chain, organized around the specific challenges of operating illegally at global scale. The management consulting firms that advise legal commodity industries on supply chain efficiency have not been hired by the cocaine trade. They haven't needed to be. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime reports record cocaine production in the 2020s, record seizures in 2022, 2023, in European ports and at American borders. More cocaine seized than ever before. More cocaine produced than ever before. More cocaine reaching markets than the gap between those two numbers implies. The drug that benumbed Niemann's tongue in a German university laboratory in 1860 is now a global industry with 160 years of uninterrupted operation. It has survived criminalization in 1914, the Harrison Act, the war on drugs, the crack epidemic, Pablo Escobar's death, the dismantling of the Medellin and Cali cartels, Plan Colombia, Operation Intercept, Operation Just Cause, more operations than any drug should need to survive, at a cost of human life and public funds that exceeds any reasonable calculation of what the enforcement was achieving. It is still here. The plant is still photosynthesizing in the Andes. Here is the thing about the gap. The gap between who you feel you are and who you believe you could be is not a cocaine problem. It is not a drug problem. It is not a failure of personal character, or a symptom of broken culture, or a consequence of modernity. It is a human condition that predates cocaine by as long as humans have been capable of imagining a better version of themselves, which is roughly as long as humans have existed. The Andean miners who chewed coca leaves 3,000 years ago were not closing a gap in the cocaine sense. They were supplementing actual physical labour at actual altitude with a tool that made the specific demands of that work more manageable. The coca leaf delivered the alkaloids slowly, sustainably, in doses calibrated by the body's own processing rather than by the sharp chemistry of purified powder. The relationship worked. It lasted 3,000 years. It produced no epidemic, no cartel, no mandatory minimum sentence, no papal gold medal. Everything that came after was the result of taking that leaf, extracting its most potent component, concentrating it, refining it, and delivering it at speed and intensity that the leaf's original design had specifically not produced. The Inca didn't need cocaine, they had coca. The difference, a difference that pharmacology has spent 160 years trying to explain and policy has spent 60 years trying to legislate, is the difference between a relationship with a plant and a transaction with a molecule. The plant grows with you, the molecule builds you, the gap itself, the persistent distance between the person you are and the person you believe you should be, is worth considering in its own right, separate from whatever substance people have used to manage it. It exists in everyone who has ever felt inadequate to a situation they believe they should have been adequate to. It exists in Freud, writing enthusiastically about a drug that was going to solve problems it was going to cause. It exists in the young man in the office bathroom with 38 minutes before the meeting, who knew what he was doing and did it anyway. It exists in the Pope who kept the flask. The gap is the reason the drug's appeal is not a mystery. It is the most legible thing about cocaine. More legible than the chemistry, more legible than the supply chain, more legible than the politics. Of course people wanted it, of course they kept wanting it. Of course the drug that made the gap disappear, even for 20 minutes, was worth more to some of them than whatever the accounting was going to cost. The tragedy is not that the accounting is hidden. By the time anyone has been using cocaine for a month, the accounting is legible. The crash is real. The distance between who you are on the drug and who you are without it grows with each use, and the person without the drug starts to feel like a smaller version of a room they remember. This information is experiential and immediate. People know it. The tragedy is that the gap is real too. The version of yourself that handles things, that was present during the meeting, that knew what to say, that felt like the person you'd always meant to become. That version is not entirely a cocaine illusion. It is a cocaine amplification of something that exists. The capability is in there. The confidence is somewhere in there. The drug found it and turned up the volume, and when the drug went away, the volume went back down, and the person left alone with the quiet had to decide what to do next. Most people didn't know that what came next was manageable without it. Most people, at the moment the gap reopened wider than it had been, could not see how to get to the other side. That is not weakness. That is the specific trap of a drug that doesn't target weakness, that targets specifically the desire to be adequate, the desire that is not weakness, but something closer to its opposite. The question the cocaine story leaves open is not whether the gap exists. It does and it will, and there is no molecule and no enforcement regime and no cultural moment that is going to close it permanently for anyone. The question is what to do with 160 years of evidence about what happens when a society responds to a molecule's exploitation of that gap by making the molecule illegal, building a criminal justice infrastructure around the people who use it, funding a military operation against the people who supply it, and counting the dead in press releases that describe the counting as progress. There are countries that have tried different things. Portugal decriminalised all drug use in 2001 and invested the enforcement savings in treatment and harm reduction. Drug-related deaths fell. HIV transmission among drug users fell. Drug use rates did not significantly increase. The cocaine was still there. The approach to the cocaine had changed and the consequences of the approach had changed. These are not perfect systems. They are imperfect systems that produce fewer deaths than the alternative and have had the intellectual honesty to acknowledge that the cocaine is going to be there regardless of the response, and that the response might as well be organised around the people rather than the molecule. The United States spent an estimated $1 trillion on the war on drugs between 1971 and the 2020s by various calculations. Cocaine is cheaper, more pure and more widely available now than when the war began. The people who did most of the time for cocaine offences during those 50 years were not the bankers who laundered the proceeds, not the executives whose compliance departments went deliberately understaffed, not the traders who used it on Wall Street floors when nobody was checking. They were the people at the low end of a supply chain that the enforcement was designed to address at its most visible, most vulnerable and least powerful point. This is not a surprise. This is a design feature, operating as designed, producing the outcomes that a careful analysis of the design would have predicted. The analysis was available. This design was chosen anyway. The cocaine is still here. The gap is still here. The supply chain is running at record volume. The prisons are full of people who are not the problem. The banks that were the problem paid fines. And somewhere in the accounting, or the real accounting, the one that the molecule never disclosed, the one that runs across 4 centuries of human history, is a number that none of the press releases, or the drug war declarations, or the mandatory minimum sentences, or the papal gold medals ever quite captured. The number of people who just wanted to feel like enough, for 20 minutes, for a meeting, for one more night in a room where the gap was closed and the version of themselves they'd always been trying to reach was finally, briefly, present. That number is very large, and it has never changed. The plant just grew. It photosynthesized in the Andes. It produced the alkaloid that altitude-adapted insects found useful, and that altitude-adapted humans found useful, and that altitude-adapted Spanish colonizers found useful for the mines, and that a German chemist found interesting enough to isolate, and name, and die, before seeing what the name would mean. The plant had no agenda. The plant had no marketing department, no sales force, no FDA approval process, no war on drugs response team. The plant had photosynthesis and 3,000 years of quiet success before the purification began. The Inca understood the plant. The Spanish understood its commercial application. Albert Niemann understood its chemistry. Every person and institution that followed understood their particular piece of it, and almost none of them understood all of it. And the ones who came closest, the people at the bottom of the supply chain, the ones who lived with the drug rather than profiting from its management, were the ones who paid the most. The gap was ours. The coca was ours. The cocaine was ours. The cartels and the prisons and the 24,000 deaths in 2021 and the HSBC settlement, and the rubber bands and the papal gold medal, and the mandatory minimums and the crack pipe and the office bathroom at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, all of ours. The plant just grew. We did the rest. And somewhere in a Colombian hillside, in a field that has been eradicated and replanted and eradicated and replanted so many times that the soil has its own institutional memory of the argument, the plant is doing it again. It does not know what all the fuss is about. It never did. It was just closing the gap between sunlight and leaf, between root and rain, between what it needed and what the earth provided. The gap the plant closes is one of the few that actually closes, cleanly, permanently, without a crash, without an accounting, without a version of itself waiting the next morning that is smaller than the version it was the night before. The plant just grew. We did the rest.